Alright, so today we are doing my February wrap-up. If you're new here, I like to do these pretty quickly, so we're just going to jump right in with some stats for the month. And in February, I read 11 books. 5 of those were audiobooks, 4 of them were ebooks, and 2 of those were physical books. I had 2 5 stars, 3 4 stars, and 6 3 stars. No 2s or 1s this month. We did a good job of reading stuff that we liked for the most part. And the very first book I read in February was Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey, and I have a review and a vlog both up already for this book. So if you want in-depth thoughts, go check those out. But this was my first 5-star of February. I loved this book so much. I think it is a great entry point into sci-fi if you're looking to get into more sci-fi, as I am. What I loved most about it was the setting of an interplanetary adventure where humans have colonized the solar system. I've not read a sci-fi like that before, but I found it to be a realistic depiction of what humans' first escapades out into space would be like. But the 2 main draws of this book are, 1, there is a great, fantastic found family crew dynamic going on, as well as a deeper underlying mystery that has a lot of the vibes I love in my mysteries and in my sci-fi. So I personally it really just worked for me, but also I think the writing was done well enough and the storyline was done well enough that it would be a great entry point for sci-fi, and I think everybody should give it a shot and read it. The second book I read was The Shape of Water by Guillermo del Toro, my accent is horrible, and Daniel Kraus. This was my first audiobook of the month, and I have seen the movie before, and I do think the book is better than the movie. I overall gave this book 3 stars. It wasn't fantastic, but it was pretty good. If you've not seen The Shape of Water or read the book, it follows Eliza, who is a non-verbal person. She works as a janitor on the night shift at a science research facility, and when this facility brings in a mythical creature to study and kind of torture, she connects to it on a personal level and decides that she wants to try and rescue this creature. It's not an animal, it's a creature. It's a little bit weird, a lot beautifully written. There's a lot of emphasis on the side characters of the story, and we get a lot of their perspectives, and there's really a commentary on human connectedness and what it means to have connections between people and what that means for who we are as individuals. Like I said, there's some weird parts to it, but overall it's a really good story. I found it was unique, but I've also heard some people say that it was reminiscent of some other stories that have been told in this genre. The third book I read was Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shauna Maguire, and this is the second book in the Wayward Children series, but at the suggestion of Murphy Napier, insert channel here, my favorite booktuber of all time, she suggests starting this series with book 2 because book 1 spoils book 2, and having read book 1 in March, I absolutely agree. I think book 2 is a way better place to start. It's better than book 1. Book 1 focuses on a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different elements, whereas book 2 gets at the heart of what the series is about, which is a discussion on portal fantasies, the children that go into through these doors or down the rabbit hole and go into another world, and then what happens when they come back. The Wayward Children series focuses on a school that has been set up to kind of rehabilitate these children that have come back, and book 2 follows the escapades of 2 twins as they go through a door at the age of 12, and they land up in a world that is not nice. It's not a nice, friendly, happy Narnia style world, but it allows them to be who they really want to be instead of the constrictions that they had on themselves in the real world. I love a good sister tale. The twins are sisters, and I thought what Shauna Maguire did here was really, really well done. The environment and the atmosphere was just very compelling, and they're very, very short books. I was reading them on Kindle, so they only took about 2 or 3 hours to read, but they are YA. There is some sexual content that I would classify this as YA books instead of middle grade, despite their length. But I gave this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed my time. I thought it was excellently done. I really enjoy Shauna Maguire's writing, as well as her intention of diversity in her books. She doesn't necessarily always do it the best, but she's very intentional about including disabled characters, characters with different sexualities, characters with different body types, characters with different races, characters with different genders. She's very intentional about including a wide range of characters, and it may not always be done in the best way, but it's very intentional, and I think that more authors need to do similar things. The fourth book I read was Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and this was an audiobook. I believe this book is getting a re-release in 2021. It was released a while ago. I don't exactly know how long ago, but it's getting re-released this year after the success of Mexican Gothic. I gave this book 3 stars. It's not exactly my style. Essentially, this is a vampire noir book set in Mexico City. So we are following a street urchin named Domingo who gets kind of entangled with a vampire named Adel, who comes from an ancient race of vampires that dates all the way back to the Mayan Empire. This is a super bloody, fast-paced story about Domingo trying to help Adel, who is running away from some other vampires that she is in a conflict with. And on top of that, Mexico City is supposed to be a vampire-free zone. So she's hiding from the authorities, trying not to die, and somehow Domingo gets interwoven into her story. A couple of things I really liked about this book was, one, Domingo's character. He's a street urchin who ran away from home. Things were not very good there, and he spends his days collecting garbage and then selling it back to, like, salvagers. But Domingo doesn't focus on what he's lost or what his life was like before or how downtrodden he is. He really is very content with his life and just accepts it for what it is, but he's also very invested in Adel's success, and he wants to help her, and he gets really attached to her even though she tries to keep him at arm's length. He almost reads as not the most intelligent person, but I'm not really sure if there's subtext there or if that was just the author's intent to kind of simplify the story. I would be very interested in researching more of what her thought process was when writing his character, because it's very unique. And also, it almost had too much world building. There are like 3 or 4 different types of vampire in this story, and Silvia Moreno Garcia goes into very detailed descriptions of their history and their magic and their capabilities and their restrictions, and it wasn't a very long book at all. Ended up being a lot of exposition dumps to try to fit in so much world that I don't necessarily think was done in the best way, and she could have trimmed back some of that stuff and it would have been fine. I don't think she's planning a sequel, at least right now, so really that world building wasn't super necessary, in my opinion. The 5th book I read was Vincent and Teo, the Van Gogh brothers story or something like that, and this was another audiobook. I gave it 5 stars. I loved this book so much. Vincent van Gogh is my favorite painter. I mean, I know that's kind of basic, but whatever. I love what he does with color. I love what he does with impressionist styling. I just love everything that he does. I'm not a huge art buff, but he's my favorite. So I loved getting to learn more about him and his history. It really goes from birth to death for Vincent, and it also includes a lot of information about his brother Teo, because they wrote a lot of letters back and forth, and they had an interesting relationship, sometimes strange, sometimes very, very close, but those letters have been cataloged and published many, many times. In this particular book, Deborah Heligman, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, puts together a narrative, weaves it in with some of the letters, and it really tells both of the brothers' stories in a beautiful way that made me cry multiple times. My absolute favorite thing about this book, though, is that Deborah Heligman did not romanticize Vincent or Teo's mental health. So a lot of times I feel like when I'm being told Vincent van Gogh's story, there's a lot of focus on how his mental illness was a driving factor in his art and how he wouldn't have been the genius that he was if it weren't for his mental illness. But what this book really does is it shows the reality of that and how difficult it was on his family and how difficult it was on his relationships with people and on his health and just how he presented himself to society. Like, she goes into the nitty-gritty detail of everything, and I've not heard his story told that way before, and I think it added so much nuance to who he was as a person, and I don't like when it's just romanticized and used as like, oh, his mental illness was a tool for his greatness, because that kind of minimizes what it actually was. I'm going a bit on a tangent about this, but it was an excellent nonfiction autobiography. I don't know the difference between the two, and if you have any interest in learning more about Vincent van Gogh or his brother Teo, absolutely pick up this book. It was stellar, 5 stars. The 6th book I read was The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, and I gave this book 4 stars. I am kind of upset with myself because I was not in the mood to read this book. As you can tell, most of what I've been reading in February was sci-fi, vampire, action-packed, the complete opposite of The Vanishing Half, which is literary fiction, commentary, and exploration on race and identity and colorism in the US, and it's very, very deep and very, very good. I was not in the mood when I was reading it, but my hold was going to expire, so I just read it really quickly. I definitely think I lost some of the heart in that experience because of that not being in the mood. I'm a huge mood reader, but I still loved the conversations that were being had and how beautifully written the story was, and there were a couple of characters that I really connected to and wanted to know more about their stories with. If you don't know anything about The Vanishing Half, it follows kind of a generational tale of the lives of two twin sisters. And these two twin sisters were born in a town that is made up of all colored people, but it's very focused on colorism. So you don't marry darker, you marry lighter. Your intention is always to get lighter. And if you're darker in this town, you're ridiculed for your skin tone. These two sisters grow up and they move away from their town and they become estranged and separated. The story follows them, it follows their daughters, it follows what the rest of their lives kind of look like as they go through life and experience what it means to be black, what it means to be light-skinned or dark-skinned, and the relationships that these characters experience and kind of how their choices affect who they become as people. And it was really beautifully done. Probably should have been a 5-star, but because I just wasn't in the mood, I didn't feel comfortable giving it 5 stars. I don't know if that makes sense. Moving on, the 7th book I read in February was Blood Promise by Rochelle Mead. This is the 4th book of the Vampire Academy series, and this series just keeps getting better and better. I am so surprised. Okay, so we all have like our mythical creatures that we lean towards, that we really enjoy. Mine is dragons and mermaids. It is definitely not vampires. I am just blown away by this series every time I read a new installment. It is so smart. It is so well done. It is so emotionally raw and real. And also just really well done with the magic system and the world building and the lore behind these vampires. I am incredibly impressed. And I'm kind of upset that I haven't heard more about this before. I think the series kind of gets a bad rap because of the questionable relationship with the age gap, which we'll get into more here in this book. But so far, this is my favorite book. If you don't know, Vampire Academy centers around an academy full of vampires. But our main character is named Rose, and she is half vampire, half human, which means she has all of the strength and agility of a human, but the hardiness of a vampire. She is a guardian, kind of tied to her best friend, who is a vampire, and so it's her role to kind of protect her. But in one of the previous books, I don't know how to not give spoilers for the series, so if you don't want spoilers for the series, just kind of skip forward. But in the previous book, she lost her lover, for lack of a better term, her boyfriend, to a strigoi, which is the dark vampire, the undead vampire. In a previous book, they had a conversation where he said he would rather die than become one of these undead vampires. So when he becomes one of these undead vampires, not by choice, Rose believes it's her responsibility to go find him and put him out of his misery. This means we get out of the academy, out of the general area of this portion of North America. We travel to Europe, we travel to Russia, we travel all over the globe, and we get to see what this world is like on a broader, grander scale, and the magic just continues to increase and develop, and it's really, really well done. I loved getting to see what the rest of the world looks like when it comes to these vampires, the extra magic that comes with that, and Rose's experience, because she's lived her whole life at the academy, basically. So for her to actually experience what it would be like to be out in the real world. Now, I have to mention, there are some questionable consent issues in this book. I can't not talk about it, okay? So the undead vampires have 1, compulsion abilities. 2, getting bit by a vampire is like getting drugged. So far in this book, it was not explored, and I hope it really does get explored, but it also just makes me feel very squeamish about where the book is headed, the series is headed, because I can tell. And I know vampire books are typically gothic and it can go in this direction. I need to do a whole video on this instead of talking about this in a wrap-up. Okay, I'm just gonna move on. Cut me off here, I'm moving on. The 9th book I read in February was New Moon by Stephanie Meyer, and I listened to this on audiobook. I read Twilight in college for the first time just because I decided I wanted to see what the books were about. If they were better than the movies. I felt like I couldn't have an opinion on the Twilight series as a whole without actually reading them. I gave this book 3 stars, and it was a typical Twilight book for the most part. Obviously, Stephanie Meyer is problematic. Obviously, there are a lot of issues with the way she writes the indigenous peoples in this book, and her feminist stuff is like completely non-existent. But I do really have to talk about why no one told me that Bella didn't just go into a coma because her boyfriend dumped her, okay? I have seen so many memes online about how when Edward left Bella, she went catatonic and couldn't move for 20 days and like kind of making fun of her for that. And even on a base level, that's wrong because breakups can really do damage to your mental health, and that should not be something that's taken lightly. But that's not just what's happening here, and I'm really upset that no one ever told me. If you've not read New Moon, if you've just seen the movie, It's not just that Edward dumped her, it is that Bella found a family for the first time in her life. Her relationship with her mom is toxic. Her relationship with her dad is toxic. She does not have friends. She is truly isolated in the world, which is one of my favorite tropes in books, is the isolated female trope. But really and truly, Bella has no connections to the world. None. Until she meets Edward, and until his family welcomes her with open arms, except for Rosalie, but still, his family welcomes her in, makes her a part of their family. For the first time in her life, she has a family, and it means something to her, and they love her unconditionally. And then they just leave. They literally up and leave, completely cut off all contact with her, and leave her stranded, isolated, in a miserable town where she has zero connections. On top of that, her boyfriend dumps her with no warning, for no reason, tells her he doesn't love her anymore, okay? If you think you could handle that and be perfectly okay, you're lying. What happens is Bella's abandonment issues that she already has from her negligent mother and from her absent father are exacerbated tenfold when she is abandoned by everyone she ever truly loved in one day. On top of that, this is in a time period where mental health is not really well accepted and not understood, and her friends, rather than being comforting for her, alienate her and think she's just gone into a weird depression state and they don't want anything to do with her. It's a bit more than just Edward dumps her and she gets sad, so she sits in her room for 6 months. That's not what's happening at all, and for the people that have ever said that, you need to check yourself, because that's so messed up. What proves this to me is that when Edward comes back, she literally actually thinks she's dreaming. Her psyche has been so damaged by what happened, it is not something simple, it is not something small, that she literally doesn't believe that he's there, and she's constantly terrified that he's going to leave again. Like, that is serious abandonment issues, serious mental health struggles, and I don't like the way people have talked about this for years now, and I'm just now jumping on, like, this whole soapbox because that's messed up, people. Other than that, the book's not great. The 10th book I read in February was Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, and this is a nonfiction. I listened to it on audio. It is retellings of Norse mythology. There is really not much to say about this book if you've ever read a mythology anthology. They're pretty simple. They're just telling the stories. Was it entertaining? Yes. Do I think he did a good job of retelling the stories? Absolutely. But, I mean, there's nothing else much to say. I gave it 3 stars. The 11th and final book I read in February was Dune Messiah by Frank Herbert. This is the second book to Dune, the original. And this review, well, this wrap-up will have spoilers for the original Dune. So if you don't want spoilers, skip to the outro. Dune Messiah is set in several years in the future from when Paul took over as Emperor of the Universe. His abilities of seeing the future and the deification that his citizens have done of him have allowed him to conquer the galaxy and set up a pretty stable government. He is very concerned for the well-being of his people, but also with an empire, it's kind of difficult to handle. So, of course, there are people that want to get him out of power. There's a lot of players that come together to try to do this, and they put together a very elaborate plan, but they have to be very careful because Paul can see the future. So it was very interesting watching what avenues they were taking, what plots they were making, how they were staying in his blind spots this entire time. Now, this is not an action-packed book. The first book had a lot more action. This one is very much just dialogue and inner monologue. It is meant to be a conversation on politics and a little bit of character. Not much happens here, but I'm very grateful that I read it because now I know how the story continues. It's a very interesting approach, very interesting resolution to Paul's empire, and it got me really excited for the next book, which is Children of Dune. I gave this book 3 stars. It wasn't anything super special, but it was fine. Just as a side note, I'm just very surprised by the way that Frank Herbert is writing his female characters. There were a couple more female characters in this book, and they were done not fantastically, but a lot better than I expected, and that was a pleasant surprise. Okay, those are the 11 books that I read in February. If you have read any of these books before, please comment down below. I would love to hear your thoughts on them, if you agree with my assessments here, or if not. Thank you guys so much for watching, even though this is late. I post videos every Wednesdays and Saturdays, or at least I try to. If you like the way I talk about the books that I read, please make sure that you subscribe. I hope you're enjoying what you're reading, and I will see you in the next video.